We are live.
Okay, we're going to call the, what's today, the 13th, June 13th, Finance Committee meeting to order. Let's go around the table and have introductions, please, starting with Mr. Fraser.
Robert Fraser, Superintendent.
Bill Stone, Director of Business Administration.
Andy Block, School Board.
Ed Tate, School Board.
Mary McKee, School Board.
Joe Hidalgo, School Board.
Ed Zellman, School Board.
Matt Frederickson, Director IT.
Denise Brooks, School Board.
And Mark Bialik, School Board. All right, Bill, take it away.
Thank you very much. We've got a number of recurring motions that happen this time of year that will be asked to move forward on the board agenda for June 20th. And then we have two discussion items, one around cooperative purchasing and the other a brief update on the Financial Advisory Committee. Okay, so the slides have the number of items on them. So this particular slide, we're requesting approval of two bids. The first bid is the medical and athletic medical supplies bid. So for the nurse's office and the athletic trainer's offices. The total bid amount $67,801. This is down by about $4,100 over last year. Despite my best efforts, I could not find anything remarkable in that change.
Is that the athletic uniform?
We'll get to that. Oh, sorry. We get to this one was just pretty straightforward. Let's do that. The second bid, to Mr. Block's point, is athletic uniform supplies and equipment. So these are for our secondary schools. And the biggest item on these bids is the replenishment of uniforms. Total amount of this bid, $157,620. This is down about $39,000 from last year. And the reason for that is when Richboro Middle School was consolidated into Holland Middle School for students and student athletes. So it was a big purchase last year, which is not recurring again this year.
If I can just make a statement and you do as we go over this. So I've got a lot of feedback from multiple schools, multiple teams about how, about our order cycle. So our athletic directors, our schools have flexibility within their within their budgets to do what they want. Athletic directors get an allocation, they can buy equipment, they can buy uniforms, whatever it is. We've got some teams going 7, 6, 5 years on cycles that are longer than this stuff's going to get worn. Or much longer this stuff's going to get worn out. That are getting piece parts. And the piece that's, I guess, a little bit more of a question for me is, are we being consistent? So you get parents in one high school looking at the other one going, how come everybody gets to do this? This one doesn't. And every time I talk to these, there's reasons for it. They're legit. But I would ask you guys to take a look there and say, hey, do we have enough to be reasonable? Because as far as I can tell, typically the buildings are given budget back. And I'm not saying spend money to spend it, but at least whatever we decide to do, maybe, make sure we're consistent. So, we don't have to look across buildings and have to answer those questions.
Yeah, I think you're right. Consistency is the key here in terms of accelerating that timeline. I would love to do the same thing with textbooks.
Yeah,
obviously that's
why that's not money.
Yeah,
But
consistency is.
there's also clothing that's going on kids. So we can make, to me, it's either you said, here's our expectation for uniforms every year. And if we can fund it, great. If we can't, boosters are spending a lot of money, and maybe that's something that we those are choices that we have to make. So, look at that the same way we look at any other extracurricular. So if there's a gap, let's just figure it out so we can be consistent. Make sure it gets addressed.
Any other questions on this?
No, but let's just note that Krista Marcel came in the meeting.
All right, so we will place that on the agenda next week. Second item on this slide is to approve our depositories. Again, required annual motion. There are no changes to to that list there, although I will point out the Stone Castle Bank at the bottom. Recall that this was discussed in the winter time. It's a program which would run through our investment advisor Cornerstone, where the district would invest in FDIC short-term CDs and to try to maximize return. So we didn't have funds that were able to be invested at that time. So then when collection starts to roll in, we will funnel some money into there on the advice of Cornerstone. So that is a new change from last year's list. But all the other okay, move that on to June 20th. All right, a lot going on this slide. We're asking for approval of 4 contracts. The first 2 are the North and South senior class trip to Disney for next April of 2020. You can see the pertinent information on there. It obviously depends on occupancy, whether they go double occupancy up to quadruple occupancy, and the number of students in there right now are estimated. That could change slightly. We are also asking approval for the North Junior Prom and the South Senior Prom for next year. Again, the information is on there. The Hyatt Regency Princeton for North Junior Prom is more of an all-inclusive contract, so that dollar amount is higher. The rental fee for the National Constitution Center for South Senior Prom is what's included in the contract for approval. The catering is a separate transaction.
Where's Jared?
I believe we've used all of these vendors before. And we had a nice presentation a couple of years ago from a gentleman whose travel agency has done the Disney trip 30 some years. I think it's a great thing. My kids have loved it. I'm just concerned about cost to families with multiple kids, multiple grades in sports, band, and chorus, and particularly senior year gets very expensive with Disney, prom, and all sorts of stuff. So I'm just thinking out loud about how sensitive we are to cost and what sort of programs there are to provide scholarships. I know with some athletic teams, fees get waived for families that request for fee waivers. But I wonder how we handle that for Disney. And I wonder if there is a big demand for financial assistance.
I can look into that.
Yeah,
And report back. From most of these activities are handled the same way that athletics are. So you got a cutoff, you got criteria. Folks go to the guidance office or the cares or whomever they're comfortable with, maybe as the activities director, and we have wide sort of ways of taking care of those students. Disney, I'm not sure about. So
Yeah.
I can find out about that. That's probably the biggest.
yeah, we can talk offline because I'm real interested in that. I'm also I'm a huge supporter of overseas study. We were able to send both our daughters to Europe for a semester. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's great when groups get to go overseas. But again, I worry about costs there. Band, chorus, and Disney, and sports, and
That's a lot.
and I've had this conversation with a couple of other parents, and I am interested in making sure that we're sensitive to costs and sensitive to the financial burden on families. Because I've seen it in sports too, personally. Sports have gotten very, very expensive. Sports have gotten year-round, and it's something that I am concerned about. That said, I think Disney's great. I'm supportive of all this.
I had a question. Do students ever do fundraising, or is there anything like that we do? We already do that. So that's a big part, because that is a nice
Especially
chunk
for
of
the
change.
overseas trips.
Yeah.
They'll do a tremendous amount of fundraising.
$2,000 for Disney, or $1,600 for how many days is that? 5 days?
Four nights maybe?
4 nights. 4 nights, 4 days at the park.
And all your meals. I think all like.
Is it the, do you know if it's the meal plan or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the meal plan is included, it's flight, it's.
Yeah.
Lodging.
It's really a bar. I mean,
They're doubles, they're doubles, don't offset our expense, I mean, we have expensive chaperone.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, the music groups and stuff have specific fundraisers to help with this. I don't think there's like a senior class fundraising thing to help offset that, so
I don't
that's a
think so.
separate thing.
They could organize
That
that.
I'm aware of, and that's South. They do breakfast, the senior class will sell breakfast sandwiches, so it's not, I mean, it's not,
I don't know that that's for
Something.
senior trip though.
it is, but it's on my list of.
No, because I thought that helped with like prom and ball dance, like extra
Yeah,
things that they do, but
Yeah,
I
it's
could
on
be
my
wrong.
list to follow what sort of fundraising efforts they have.
Those dates, April 14th through 18th, is that like a testing week for the district?
Not at the school level,
What?
not off high school.
No, I know, is it in the rest of, is that why it was chosen for that week?
I can answer that question. I'm not sure, but certainly, you know, any of the high school exams, whether they be Keystone or advanced placement, would all be after that date.
Yeah, I mean, because it used to be that they would plan the senior trip when PSSA was happening for everybody else. So that the seniors would be off, you know, out of the building, because those would be shorter days for them anyway.
I don't know if that's when we were given the high school PSSA or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there would be much of an impact one way or the other.
I guess, I don't know the calendar offhand, spring break is before the senior trip next year. When is spring break next year?
It is the order before that, I think, in 4th or 11th.
Oh, so like directly after spring break?
Yeah, I think the 4th or 11th is a Saturday.
Yeah, okay.
So this would be the following, thereabouts anyway.
I always want to go on that trip.
So,
It's a good thing.
Ed, are you suggesting looking at the district somehow subsidizing some students or?
No, the district shouldn't. It should, I think it should be funded like athletic teams do, where there's a pool. Or part of what paying families pay for. There's a reserve that provides scholarships, to use, lack of a better term. I know there are a few kids every year who don't go to Disney for various reasons, and I just hope it's not cost for any of them.
Well, I'm sure it is. I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, on the flip side, I know when my kids were in school, like there were kids, they know this is coming senior year. They like to start saving in 9th grade. Like they know to target that. It's not like it's an unexpected cost, but
It is a huge gift to the kids.
absolutely.
Mhm.
It's senior year.
I mean, I think it's kind of cool. You see these 18-year-olds and get so excited to go down there as a group to Disney.
And they come back totally whipped. You have to.
Mhm.
It's a wonderful, I'm just saying.
Yeah, I can't say I'm looking forward to it as a parent here.
Aren't you
And it
chaperoning?
goes, and it goes off,
Yes, I am now.
it goes off flawlessly almost every year. I mean,
Awesome.
you know, it's just amazing. Such
Well
a
run.
huge group of kids goes, it goes well, they behave wonderfully, they have a great time. It's a great.
Yeah, knock on wood. Well, that might be a really great opportunity to have a connection with one of our service groups, because I would think that if, depending on how many kids we can identify through guidance or the nurse's office, whoever drives that information cares. If it's 5 kids, if it's 10 kids, I don't know what that number is, but I think you probably could get some help out there in the community to,
That's an interesting idea.
yeah, because, you know, we do a lot of fundraising as community organizations, and not that there's not places to send the funds all the time, but this is a really fun and exciting one.
Yeah, it is.
The only other point I'd add on these contracts is, Mr. Cox had reviewed them, but we are in the position of needing Disney more than Disney needs us, and similarly with the prom. So there's not much he offers in terms of revisions to the contracts, but he has put his eyes on these, given that they're significant.
Where are they staying, you know?
They are in
All-Star movies.
one of the all-stars, specified all-star, one of the all-stars.
And what about the junior prom at South and the senior prom at North?
Those were 2-year approvals.
Oh, were they?
Taken care of next year.
Okay.
So next for the agenda is the establishment of committed fund balance. Generally accepted accounting principles require that the school board commit to the categories of fund balance that it sets aside before the end of the fiscal year, so before June 30th. But then those amounts are determined after the audit is completed. So we need to get on the record that these are the categories of fund balance where we may commit funds. And then once the audit is completed and we have final numbers, we'll insert dollar amounts into those categories. So there are no changes to the categories proposed for next year. The 3 being educational initiatives, healthcare expenditures, and to balance the 2019-2020 budget. I will say that there is, although the category didn't change, the thrust of what we intend to use the educational initiatives bucket will change. As the strategic plan is just about ready to be finalized, we may have some non-recurring expenditures to get that plan up and running. So we would begin to use those funds for that purpose. As we look to the future, 2 things to consider. One, we'll obviously, once I have more time to study our numbers, I may make different recommendations around what categories we have. For example, healthcare expenditures. We've had 2 very strong years of healthcare experience. And so our internal service fund that services medical claims seems to be sufficient in terms of its fund balance. So we may not need to set aside additional funds on our general fund. I'm not going to ensure that our healthcare experience continues to perform well. So we may think about transferring those funds somewhere else if we don't have risk in that area.
Hey, Bill,
Yes, sir.
any sense on why we're seeing that decrease? Is it managed better? Or, I mean, it's fair if you don't know, that's, because usually we're hearing in the news that healthcare's going up.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as experience. We just haven't had claims in the last couple of years, and we've been fortunate. Now, that trend is the good experience trend is sort of consistent across other school districts. The one I came from had good experience and is continuing to have good experience. So I don't know if that speaks to just double up in the 2 places that
I
I've
think
been.
a little bit of a focus on people leading more healthy lifestyles now, especially where you've got an economic development that's stronger. I mean, you see it in the SIN businesses. It's, you go there and you see those going down, and that's a bunch of people being healthier, which has an impact.
I mean, we as a self-funded entity, I mean, we are subject to, the exposure of, a couple of high claims can really change the dynamic of our experience. So we hope that carries on the way that's it's a good position to have sufficient fund balance in that internal service fund so that you can sort of ride the highs and lows.
Reality is you can have a single person with a health condition that could blow the whole thing up.
You have one heart surgery.
Yeah, or, hepatitis. I mean, certain drugs alone are, so that's what that's there for.
What do we have users? What do we have committed fund balance for users?
I believe it wasn't committed last
I'll look at
year.
you, do you remember what we got?
I believe it was
Because we held it for a while, I guess my question
It
is,
17, 18.
is that
I'll confirm
a good call? Doing it, let's see.
So
Yeah,
this action is, by taking this action next week, the board will essentially wipe out the commitments from last year. And
So the buckets are the same.
well, right, yes, but so at the time, it wasn't that we may not have used the PSERS money, we may just have said that money is going to get reallocated to a different bucket. So I'll double check. I believe it was, the last year was on our books, for the fiscal year ended June 30th of 17.
Right. That's what I was-
The second item for consideration in future years is that our practice has been, once we allocate funds into these committed buckets, we'll then calculate how much of our, we'll calculate 5% of our next year's budget and put that in what we call the unassigned fund balance bucket, which is the rainy day fund. Then any difference gets transferred into the capital reserve. So the number the last couple of years has been $3 million. So that's not codified in policy. We may want to consider doing that. We may want to consider budgeting for that capital reserve transfer. So we'll have some ideological discussion around whether, as a look at this next when we have our financial numbers, and we'll talk about what the approach should be to that. So that capital reserve fund transfer, I think this is my indication that that number could be more than 3 million, less than 3 million, depending on how the results go.
I appreciate that, because every year I have this thought of like, well, what if it doesn't work out? What if we don't have the money for the summer projects, and then we're deferring maintenance that we need, and we know how that goes. So I welcome that conversation.
Any questions on this? I'm sorry. Any questions on this section?
No.
Very well. Move this on to the agenda for next week. The last agenda item for June 20th is our insurance renewal. So you recall at our last finance committee meeting, we had Mr. Dyer here from the Seltzer Group, our insurance broker. He gave us a rundown of what our current coverages were and the process to go out to market to obtain competitive pricing. So what I'll share with you, big picture, is that absent that market competition, our insurance costs would have actually gone up. So this first column here shows the expiring premium for our 3 broad categories of insurances at $1.12 million. The adjusted cost, because of increases in property values due to our renovation projects, and our cost of workers' comp, which again, we talked briefly about that, our experience has increased because we're carrying a couple of bad years in our calculations. So our cost would have actually grown about $50,000 absent any marketing efforts. But I'm pleased to report that our renewal cost came in at just under $1.1 million, includes coverage changes that the district was looking at as part of our targeted risk analysis. Still came in $73,000 under budget. So again, you can see we had good competition, three quotes on the package, which is property, crime, general liability, directors and office liability, and 6 quotes on the workers' comp side. So we did very well.
Bill, do you know what was the trend in prior years? Were we paying more when we were renewing or paying?
I don't know. I will.
I'd be interested to see that. Are you moving on from insurance renewal?
I am not. I was moving to the next slide. So I'm going to review with you what coverage changes are included in our renewal. And again, the effort that we undertook was we took once the quotes came in from the carriers, we looked at where we were in comparison to budget, and then we sort of did this analysis of lining up what we could consider, and then looked at the dollar amounts to see if we could afford to fit it into that bucket. So I'll review these quickly with you. So we carry an excess liability policy, which is sort of like an umbrella. So we have a general liability policy, then we were carrying an extra $20 million on top of that. So I've had conversations with both our broker and with Mr. Cox about whether that was an appropriate amount, because as you may be aware, Pennsylvania school districts are subject, their liability is capped at the state level at $500,000. So that $20 million number would only be pierced if we had a federal claim. So we analyzed the risk around claims in special education, bullying claims, any First Amendment claims. And I asked Mr. Cox to look at case law, current exposure out there. And we just weren't seeing the exposure to that $20 million limit. In fact, when I initially presented this to cabinet, I was going to recommend going to a $5 million excess liability. Because again, we're carrying a limit, which I'm not remembering, but I can look up. We're already carrying a general liability. So remember, this is sitting on top of that liability amount. So I thought in an abundance of caution if I was going to bring it down, to just take it to 10 million. And that's a saving of about $9,000. The employee dishonesty limit, so we also carry a bond if an employee is dishonest and steals money from us. Obviously, we're a large organization and we were carrying $1 million limit there. That to me felt a little low given the ease of larger dollar transactions. So I thought that carrying a higher limit there would be more prudent, given the size of some transactions that we make here. I'm also recommending that we add pollution liability coverage. Now, this is not because I believe that there are any imminent risks, but I'll share that in this area, there have been a couple of school districts who have had some significant mold claims. And our policy, absent this additional coverage, would only cover the first $250,000 in expenses. Both of those claims that I saw in the local area were at least $1 million. So the recommendation is to add $1 million pollution liability policy. It would also cover our underground storage tanks. It would cover if there was an issue with the leach field at Redstown Elementary. So it would give us some broader coverage. But I think that given the risk of mold and the expense that it can generate with even a small issue, this was a worthwhile investment of just under $35,000.
Well, let me just think about that for a second. So obviously the difference between $250,000 and $1 million in coverage, how extreme can the claims become? Have you seen anything well above $1 million? Because I'm thinking, and I know it's 20 years, right, to make up that difference, right? But couldn't we kind of self-insure with that difference? But that's a big one. $35,000 additional dollars is a big one. So I'm just wondering if we wouldn't, considering the renovations and the new buildings and the things that we're working on, and confidence in Doug Taylor, knowing that he's in there and we've got a good team in there, helping to identify these issues. I just wonder if that might be excessive.
Yes.
Because of the cost to the insurance. That's a heavy cost for $1 million worth of insurance.
Yeah. So I don't see this coverage continuing on much beyond when we get to the schools that don't have air conditioning.
Okay.
So I view it as a short term. Now, the case that I'm most familiar with was in Upper Brookhaven School District, and that was some mold in their gymnasium, and it kind of got sucked into the ductwork. That was $1 million. So this policy would have done a good damage on that. Now, again, we'll actually have $1.25 million because we've got $250,000 on our property policy, and so this is it's almost like that excess liability policy.
Could you identify the buildings that you want to insure, or that doesn't make sense? I'm just wondering if that would dramatically, if they're renovated or built in 2018, 2017, that might help.
It's a good question, because what I worry about, you reference all the new renovation and new construction we have going on. It's the other schools in particular whose roofs need to be replaced. And to Denise's point, are we going to have that $1.5–2 million that summer to do that, or aren't we? That's, I think, really susceptible in certain spots.
Yeah. And by the way, right here.
So I can follow up with Mr. Dyer and see if we can laser any
School specific.
school specific.
Building specific.
It's expensive because it's a high risk.
It is,
And especially you can already tell the schools that that haven't been renovated that this is a big risk. So
Yeah, I would presume
Until
that
they're
these
done.
costs would have been significantly last year. So we are kind of catching the market with it. I can follow up. I am not recommending terrorism coverage for the property, the $8,500. That is I asked a number of targeted questions around how do you define terrorism, because you may hear in the news that if someone comes into a building and threatens that they are charged with making terroristic threats. That is not terrorism. Terrorism is vehicle crashing into the building with intent to harm, airplane crashing into the building. This is, I don't see this as a huge risk in public school districts. And we have property coverage that would not cover a terrorist event. But again, this was, I've not carried it in prior school districts. We are in the minority around not carrying. If we chose not to move ahead with that coverage, we would be in the minority of school districts. But it's been my experience that the risk there is low.
Bill, the coverage amount for that 8,500 premium is
Ms. Binder.
fair.
That was too quick.
It's, if I recall our cabinet discussion correctly, it's not nearly enough to cover the actual costs if we experience one of these events. That's why Bill felt he suggested Ken bring me here tonight to forego this particular aspect.
Next on the list is to add law enforcement liability coverage. So we have school resource officers in our buildings. They carry weapons, and there is risk, even though we are not the employer of those individuals, that if we would be named in a suit if they
Wouldn't our cap of 500,000 apply to that?
It would again depend on the nature of the claim. It's a state claim or a federal claim. Now that's for lawyers to decide. But yes, we would be, if it were a state claim, we would have immunity on that.
It's pretty easy to include in a police action violation of civil rights, which would be a federal claim,
Indeed.
whether it's just some kind of unlawful apprehension or.
So
Can I ask though, is that only for damages, or does it also cover litigation costs?
I will confirm that. The only thing I have here is just the limit, $1 million limit.
Okay.
The next two coverages I'm recommending that we decline those. The first is foreign liability coverage. We don't have a lot of foreign trips in the district, and we may have other options around repatriation if a staff member falls ill while chaperoning. To get them back to the States would be very costly, but we may have that through our workers' comp policy. We may have some repatriation under foreign liability. And we also have the student accident policy for students, which could help offset some of those costs. So if I find that in between now and our board meeting that those coverages are not confirmed, this would actually be one that I would change over to a green check.
That is such a little amount of premium.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, like, I recently booked a trip that I had to pay for in advance. I took trip insurance. It's a lot more than that. I mean, that's a very nominal amount, I feel like.
Depends on what the coverage is again.
Right, and if it's duplicated.
So as I mentioned, I have follow-up to do with our broker on whether or not he can confirm that those coverages existed on the basis to cover us. I will update you before you take action. And lastly, we had considered, we've struggled a bit with our current provider around service issues. And so when we were analyzing the overall package of insurance, we had hoped that the renewal might come into the point where we could go with a provider who provides better service. So we were recently with PMA, very happy with their service. Both Ms. Taylor and I have used SDIC, a very good school district focused entity, but the cost just would have kicked us up over our budget amount. So we are going to, I think this is a good practice. We're going to try to address the service issues with the carrier and let them know that we consider switching because of the service, and hope that things improve. And do this every year, so we may have an opportunity to scale. So that's about $33,000 of additional coverages, but still $73,000 under budget. Any questions?
I have a quick question. We just looked at insurance renewals at MBIT, and one area that they were recommending to increase was for cyber insurance and the danger of ransomware. Are we sufficiently covered? Would you consider increasing that?
I believe we are. We have very good cyber coverage.
Matt?
It's not a bad policy.
Does anyone happen to know the dollar amount attached to that?
Depending on the, we have a number of limits. We have a maximum single limit of $1 million, and then we have business interruption loss at 500,000, digital data recovery 500,000, network extortion $1 million, computer fraud 250K, social engineering 250K, funds transfer fraud 250K.
So we're covered. Thank you.
And so these are the actual recommendations, line coverage and the company. These are all the incumbents. The only difference is that pollution liability policy is new for 1920. All right. So that's
So before you come off of the insurance, so this is the first year with our new broker, and we talked about this on the phone. And I know that you didn't have any experience with Pace and Noe, but can you just say what your overall experience is with this new broker and how they may have helped? I know that a lot of these things were Bill's initiative, these other items to look at, but I think they've been helpful as well as bringing different ideas to the district.
yes, yeah, I would say that on that list, it's probably half and half effort of some of my ideas and experiences and seltzer groups. I was pleased with the market response, which is a result of their efforts. They did all the legwork on making sure that we had good responses and that there was competition. I'm also pleased with their philosophy around risk control. They believe really strongly that, especially on the workers' compensation side, that you can control your risk in making sure you understand your claims and where your claims are coming from, and then targeting specific actions to reduce slips and falls, or if there's a number of claims of people falling because they were standing on a chair with casters, to make sure that you have the education around those kinds of things. So that I've been pleased so far with that, and am optimistic that they'll be able to help us with some of the service issues on the workers' comp side.
Great. Thank you.
All right, so we have 2 items for discussion, and I'm looking for feedback on the first one. So I'm hopeful to expand the district's use of cooperative purchasing. So let me give you just very quickly what that is. Cooperative purchasing is something that we are already doing here in Council Rock. It's permitted by statute. It's basically a government entity in another part of the state or the country prepares a bid, conducts a bid, gets pricing, and then allows other entities to piggyback on that pricing. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in the respect that another government has done the work around public bid, but we wouldn't have to, but then we also expedite our purchasing process around it. So
It is typically a more efficient way to purchase because you don't have the lag time of preparing the bid, putting it out on the street, advertising it, getting responses, seeking board approval. You can use preferred vendors, so you can target a subset of vendors who are on a purchasing cooperative rather than acceptance of a low bid situation. And pricing is negotiable on these cooperatives, so you don't have to take the prices that are available. You are able to negotiate with the vendors. So with that ease comes some potential drawbacks. And I pose the question of whether you always get the best price absent some competition on a purchasing cooperative, because certainly the vendors know that the district can just go and buy it without having to jump through the hoops of the bid. So and vendors have to pay to belong to cooperative. So there is that.
And the thinking traditionally is because you're open to a very large universe of purchasers, by a lower price because your volume can be higher. Typically, and that's the theory.
Correct. The other item is just the perception around not publicly bidding. So, I think that a purchase that comes out of, that is a result of a public bid, typically comes with the assurance to the public that you've done a good quality competitive process. So you have to balance that the time and effort it takes around public bid. Public bid is not always the least expensive option for purchasing versus the efficiencies that you might be gaining from and maybe a slightly higher cost around a cooperative. So I don't recommend, and I'll get into the details of my recommendation in a couple of slides, but this is about a balance and providing more options for our departments, our coordinators, staff members, cabinet to make smart decisions around purchasing and to be as efficient as possible, because it does, it costs my office time and money to go out to bid. This is certainly not a recommendation to replace the very good practices we have in place already around bidding. This is, I don't believe I've seen a district that bids more than Council Rock. That's not something I intend to break down. I want to keep what we have in place, but there are times when it's practical to use a purchasing cooperative. So I'm going to use Mr. Frederickson as an example. So he's interested, hypothetically, he's interested in buying 100 Chromebooks over the summer. So in lieu of going out for a public bid, which would take at least 6 weeks of time, depending on when the board meeting is scheduled, he could go to 3-5 vendors and say, this is the model of Chromebook I'm interested in. Send me back your best price. I'm seeking pricing from 4 other vendors. And do sort of a streamlined RFP where he might have a response in 48, 72 hours from 5 vendors.
But they have to be in that group.
But they have to belong, and right, you have to stipulate what purchasing cooperative and contract number you can purchase that under. So you get that sort of best of both worlds situation where you've got price competition, but you're doing it in a much more efficient way. So you get that bid protected price, you control the field of vendors, so you know that you can trust that the vendor will deliver the quality product that's specified, will deliver it on time. And you also are getting that multiple vendor competition, right? So you can say, I don't want to buy your CoStar's price or your US Communities price. I'm doing competition. I want your best price. Know that I'm going to get it from a few other folks. So this has been something that I've had success doing. We could use it in a number of areas. The small dollar office supply projects where something kind of pops up after the bid you didn't know you were going to need, a few more pencils or a small piece of office equipment, maybe a fax machine, all the way up to select summer projects. So there's certain projects, roof replacements, for example, where there are a lot of bad roofing companies, and you really don't want to get one. Risk around a bad roof.
I would not recommend using a purchasing cooperative for the Soul Finestone renovation. That should be a more traditional public bid process, but on a roof replacement, that's a good way to use this process. Do you have a question?
Yes, when you do this on even the preferred providers, can they come in even lower than what was actually, so they can do that?
Yes.
I really like it.
The cooperative purchasing price is the maximum.
Right.
So if you did nothing but just call XYZ vendor, that they would have to honor that price. It couldn't be higher.
What kind of spending controls would be in place, though, from the departments and just within their budget? Because if it's not coming in front of the board each time, there's just kind of like this implicit approval, right?
Well, so they would follow the same internal purchasing protocols around submitting a requisition to their, the supervisor, the budget supervisor, who then has to send it up to my office for approval. So we have the same purchasing controls that we have in place now. What I'd be looking for here was an approval from the board to utilize a few more purchasing cooperatives, and then develop some guidelines that folks would have to follow around what process I would like to see undertaken for these projects. So we talked about that sort of hybrid of using the purchasing co-op, but still doing the necessary price searching. So you've got a couple of options here that, again, we already have a few that we're using, and they typically, the summer projects, there were a few that were on CoStars, and there was one that was on US Communities. So that came forward to the board for approval, and a large project like that would still be. But some of these smaller dollar items, Mr. Cox and I believe that a blanket approval with him having looked at the terms and conditions of the purchasing cooperative to make sure that it's copacetic with Pennsylvania procurement laws could open up some efficiencies in my office and in the respective buildings and departments. So my recommendation would be that my office is looking at these particular cooperatives with the help of Mr. Frederickson, Mr. Taylor, to see which of these options offers the best options for purchasing items. So we can give a list of these to Mr. Cox and say, make sure that these look okay. He's confident that before our June 20th meeting, he'd be able to do that review and be able to prepare a motion for the board that would essentially grant the administration the ability to use these purchasing cooperatives for the upcoming fiscal year, and moving forward, it would be an action that we would renew each year and perhaps drop those that we don't use a lot, add any new ones. But it's been a successful strategy for me. I think it gives it's a good win for some of the frustrations around the bidding process, which does take time at the building level and is not flexible and responsive. And this is perfectly acceptable in terms of the law. So I think if we can develop some good guidelines around using that kind of hybrid approach, that this is a way we could be more strategic in our purchasing.
So when you say guidelines, does that mean policy, administrative regulations, just internal process?
I think just internal. Yeah, an internal,
Nothing we have to
document.
Nothing we have to take on from a formal action standpoint other than kind of give you guys some direction.
If you want to, we're happy to route it that way, but I don't see a need to.
That's-
I think if after a few months and maybe a year of seeing how this works, an AR might not be a bad thing depending on response, if this is popular enough or if there's enough time where I'm sort of redirecting to the more appropriate use that, maybe an AR certainly carries a little bit more weight, but
Let it go.
yeah, I think that would be great.
So I guess from my perspective, I appreciate you guys asking for the additional flexibility. As far as I'm concerned, we approve a budget every year, and what you guys do within that budget, as long as we've got the visibility when we need it, the best way to go about it, I defer to you guys to do that. So I support this. Anything from a capital standpoint that falls outside of the annual appropriations budget, I'd want to at least have a look at. And I imagine if we started doing this, you guys would be determined, okay, hey, what's the dollar threshold? I would imagine you guys would be very conservative. But Russ, and I think the other thing that would be interesting to know after a year of doing this, is kind of what the experience is to your point about, do we have to write any policy or what this is, and then maybe that, hey, it builds confidence, maybe open it up to a wide range of stuff, but so it's with this.
And as you all know, we've come a long way from a bidding standpoint over the years. And to me, what Bill was proposing here, and I support 100%, keeps the core of that. It keeps the integrity of that. You know, where we were falling short, we're still not going to be falling short, while at the same time simplifying some processes, becoming more efficient, and becoming a little bit less frustrated with it. It's just, to me, it represents a nice happy medium.
So this eliminates a situation where you get a dozen or 20 bids for something. Is that sort of the intent, to reduce the number of bidders?
Not necessarily. If you, in certain situations of that group of 20, you might only really want to buy from 3 or 4.
Right.
So you want to use it in the areas where you don't want to be stuck with an irresponsible bidder.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the device example is a pretty good one, because I know that Mr. Frederickson wants to know that his devices are going to show up on time and as specified, because if they don't, then he's got a real problem to get them ready for school.
Yeah.
Mr. Taylor doesn't want a bad roofer up here fixing the leaks.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that it's buttoned up and we can trust the person up there.
Makes sense.
Isn't it also, and a big part of this is savings of time and efficiency for everyone involved? Because if we're looking at 100 Chromebooks, typically somebody has to draft an RFP and then has to go through all that, and it's got to be prepared. Maybe 6 weeks, we're shortening, and there's less staff involved.
So I had a meeting with some staff members in the tech ed department. They were asking some questions around, hey, what happens if something breaks in the middle of the year? So that we were talking about table saw. So that's a larger piece of equipment that, you know, you may be able to foresee that you need to replace it, but sometimes they just break when they break, and they need that piece of equipment, and they need it pretty quickly. To go through a bid, that's 6 weeks. If it breaks, the day before a school board meeting, we've got to advertise for 3 weeks. We've got to get it on the board agenda, and it takes a lot of time that they're not able to use it. Whereas if I can say to them, and I use this very example, find 3 vendors who are in these cooperatives. We'll have Donna Heverly in my office send out a mini RFP that says this is the piece of equipment we are looking for. Provide your cost and your the purchasing cooperative. We might have that piece of equipment in a week. Vendors might respond in 24 hours. So it's just that in those kind of situations, it's a really.
So what are you looking for from us on June 20th? What kind of approval?
So what I'm looking for from you tonight is to sort of give me the green light to give Mr. Cox a phone call to say, look, the finance committee was supportive of the idea. They would like to see an action on the board agenda. It would essentially be something to the effect of that the board approved the use of these specific purchasing cooperatives for the 2019-2020 school year.
Okay.
So there's
Thank you
no,
very much.
so you're just establishing a relationship with these different, there's no like minimums that we would have to do or like, so it's just establishing the relationship and then you develop the process
We
of
join
what.
the cooperative, and which allows us to participate. We won't join any that have a fee, because there are enough options that are no fee. But we become a member and then can piggyback that purchase.
Does anyone have an objection to this coming to our next meeting as described? No?
Oh, real quick, Bill, are you going to cap the amount under this situation? Like, is it nothing above a $10,000 purchase, or is it going to be open-ended to? I mean, I'm sure something along the lines of a large construction we're not going to do, but like you said, but is it fair to say that $10,000 is enough for an open bid?
So I might actually do the opposite, which would be require the use of that RFP process over a certain dollar amount. So if that table saw costs 10 grand, I might say, guys, I know you found one under purchasing cooperative, but go get me 2 other prices and do that streamlined RFP. Whereas if it's if it's 2 Chromebooks that, just, we had, 2 extra kids show up, we didn't have enough spares, and Matt needs to get them quick, that's, we still have, we know that we've got bid protected pricing, and we don't need to necessarily jump through the hoops of a larger RFP, more formal process.
It's just done a lot around the country. Just actually ironically, I just read an article, the Michigan School District saved a ton of money and had great relationships with different businesses. And then how many times I've been on the phone about Chromebooks? When's your bid expires? I want more Chromebooks. So I applaud this. This is great.
So we won't see a not to exceed in that, whatever comes from.
Thank you very much. The last item is a very brief update on the Financial Advisory Committee. We've extended the application deadline to June 28th to allow some more time to seek out some candidates. I'm also going to be reaching out to some folks in the business community to try to solicit more interest. I'm up to 9 applications. I've looked at them today. There's good candidates. We've got, I don't know if we exactly have the candidates as you described in the board meeting, but retired CEOs, VP of sales, food company, woman who works for the audit quality department at the AICPA. So yeah, it's some interesting resumes.
And remind me of the process. So we're not going to go through these resumes collectively. You're going to make recommendations. And
We are.
yes.
Well, as far as I said, 100%. Did you talk about what the district resumes that came in? Where in the district they came in? Were you able to?
I did not do geographic distribution. I saw at least 3 Churchvilles. But other than that.
Churchville, that great place.
Churchville is a great place.
Andy, would you like that info now based on the 9 that we have in, or waiting until the 28th for us to report out to you on that? Anyways, on.
I don't, why don't you guys focus on who the best people are, to the extent it can be as geographically diverse in terms of representing the district, that would be great, but focusing on the quality of the folks first.
Sure. And I don't think, even if they were, if it was concentrated in one area, we don't have this situation we did with like a redistricting committee, right? They're not going to focus on what's financially, there's no way to financially lean it one way or the other for a municipality.
Couldn't
That's why I
there,
said focus on the quality first.
right, but couldn't there be people outside the district? I was thinking that it would be more expansive than just they have to live in the district to be on the committee.
Somebody
wasn't a requirement,
somebody
was
has
it?
asked me that. I reached,
I don't think so.
I
I would
reached-
think it was broad.
well, I reached out to a corporate executive who just moved out of the district. I didn't know that empty nesters kind of thing, and I said, no, I think we would prefer that it be a district resident.
You guys get the game.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you have to have a vested interest, whether, on some level.
Yeah.
I would almost be suspicious for someone outside the district who wanted to come in here and do that.
I was really tempted.
You got
to
somebody
say-
in the district, at least you know they're a taxpayer and like they want one.
If we get a resume from Warren Buffett, I say that we.
Yeah,
Let's rethink.
I'll follow up.
Only if he helps us with the bidding process.
Well, it wasn't part of the requirements when you advertised.
There weren't any,
Okay.
there weren't any requirements, residency or otherwise.
Right.
Just if you're interested in that.
I don't know, it's outside business if it's.
With this committee?
Yeah, it's just a question.
Okay. Do you have anything else?
I'm finished.
Okay.
I was just wondering, like plaques, where we're at with the plaques for the educational foundation at the 2 middle schools. Have you heard anything or any updates on that?
Do you know? That's a correct question, right, for the plaques, where we're at for the fundraising for the plaques.
Oh, yeah.
Any idea?
I don't think that was, I can ask.
Yeah.
It'd be good to get an update.
Kristen can report at our board meeting.
There you go. Thanks.
And I will be there. I will not be on a plane next time.
Okay.
Bill, one more thing, Bill. Would this be a right time to ask about arbiters' awards?
I won't be.
solutions, the payment solutions, did you have a chance to go over that? Is that something you're still looking?
We did, if the district is going to, move forward, we're trying to schedule a demo with Central Bucks to see how they have it set up. But that would be something we would bring, over the summer.
Oh, okay, good.
Yes, we are still working.
Anything else? Through the group?
No? No public. Well, do you have any public comment, young man?
You want to say?
Want to say anything? No?
Good choice.
You scored a goal in your last game. Say that again.
No, thank you.
Okay, hearing nothing else, meeting adjourned.